the chaos we hide behind. It didn't happen overnight. The fall wasn't a sudden plummet, but a slow drift, like waves quietly pulling you from the shoreline until you look up and realize the coast is no longer in sight. That's how I ended up here, in the mess. And not just a mess of circumstances, but a mess of heart, of choices, of soul. No one wakes up one morning and decides to self-destruct. The chaos creeps in. One compromise here, one secret there. One hurt buried beneath another fake smile, until suddenly the mirror doesn't lie anymore. You're lost, exhausted, and afraid to admit how far you've drifted. But here's the dangerous thing about chaos. You get used to it. You learn to function in dysfunction. You wear the noise like armor. It numbs the ache but never heals it. And in my mess, I built a life. Outwardly successful, inwardly crumbling. I learned how to post the highlight reel while hiding the bruises. The unraveling didn't come as a dramatic crash, but as a quiet implosion. I was standing in the kitchen one afternoon pouring coffee when the tears began, unexpected, uncontrollable. I dropped the cup, shards flew, and I collapsed, not because of the mess on the floor, but because I could no longer contain the mess inside me. Years of pretending, of performing, of pushing away pain had caught up to me. I had nothing left. That night, I went for a drive. No destination, just motion. I found myself parked in front of an old church I hadn't been to in years. The lights were off, but the memory of once being whole inside those walls hit me like a wave. I whispered, "God, I don't even know if you're still there. But if you are, I need you. I don't know how to come back. I don't even know who I am anymore. But if you can find me in this mess, please do." Silence followed. Not the kind that stings, but the kind that soothes. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't see a sign. But for the first time in months, I felt something crack. Not me. The wall I had built. The next few days were strange. Nothing changed on the outside. Bills still came, people still asked for my time, emails still flooded in, but something was shifting inside. I started noticing small moments. A song on the radio that felt like a message. A verse someone posted online. A stranger who said something kind. Grace was reaching me, not in a wave, but in gentle ripples. I was still broken, still ashamed, still tangled in consequences. But I wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The hard part about coming to the end of yourself is realizing how much of your identity was tied to things that were never meant to define you. Your performance, your image, your productivity, your approval. Stripped of those things, I had no idea who I was. But I sensed God wasn't done with me, that even here in the pit, He was present. I started journaling again. The pages were messy, raw, unfiltered. But in writing, I found honesty. And in honesty, I found healing. I wrote things I hadn't dared say out loud. I let God into rooms I had locked up tight. I confessed. I questioned. I cried. People around me didn't know the full story. Most of them still don't. They saw changes, some subtle, some drastic. I wasn't as loud. I didn't hide behind humor as much. I began saying no to things that drained me. I started sitting in silence longer. One evening, I read the story of the prodigal son again. I'd read it 100 times before, but this time, something struck me differently. It wasn't the son's return that moved me. It was the father's run. He didn't wait on the porch. He didn't demand an apology first. He ran toward the mess, toward the failure, toward the smell of pigs and shame. And I realized that's what grace looks like. That's who grace is. He doesn't stand at a distance, arms crossed. He runs toward the chaos, toward the confusion, toward the questions. My story didn't turn around in a day. There was no cinematic redemption arc. It was more like crawling in the dark, reaching for a hand I could barely see. But every time I reached, he was there. There were relapses. Not into old addictions, but into old mindsets. I still believed I had to earn love, that God would only stick around if I proved I was worth it. But grace kept whispering, "You're already mine." That whisper became louder. It met me in therapy sessions, in long walks, in the voices of friends who refused to let me isolate, in books that spoke directly to my wounds, in a slow return to church, not as a performance, but as a place of presence. And I began to believe it. Not just know it, but feel it. That I was loved, as is, mess and all. Looking back, I see now that the chaos wasn't just something I endured. It was something God used. Not because he caused it, but because he refused to waste it. The mess became the soil where mercy grew. The darkness became the backdrop where light shined brighter. So if you're in the middle of your own mess, hear this. God isn't afraid of it. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't retreat. He draws near. Not to scold you, to save you. And maybe, just maybe, the chaos isn't the end of your story. Maybe it's the place where the real story begins, the invitation in the middle of the mess. There's a strange stillness that follows collapse. After the dust settles and the world no longer feels like it's crashing down, you're left with silence. But it's not the absence of noise, it's the ache of what now? I found myself there. Not drowning anymore, but unsure how to swim. The chaos was no longer roaring, but I had no idea what peace was supposed to sound like. It was in that fragile space that the invitation came. Not from a preacher, not from a sermon. It came in a whisper, somewhere deep inside, that said, "Let me in." Not the cleaned up version, the real you. At first I resisted, because I thought God only wanted the polished parts. The version of me that looked good in church. The one who raised hands during worship and took neat notes during the message. Not the version who doubted, who cussed under breath, who still had a hidden bottle in the kitchen drawer. But God kept whispering, "I want that you too." So I said yes. Not a loud yes, a trembling one. A yes that felt more like a question than a declaration. But it was honest. And when I opened the door even slightly, he rushed in. Not with condemnation, but with comfort. Not with shame, but with safety. I wasn't struck down, I was held. That yes changed everything. Not overnight, not even over a month, but slowly, in 1,000 little ways. I started seeing invitations everywhere, in conversations that turned spiritual without planning, in sunsets that felt like paintings just for me. In old journal entries I stumbled across that reminded me he'd been pursuing me all along. God wasn't waiting at the finish line, he was walking with me, in the mess, through the fog, by my side. There's a verse in Revelation where Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." For years, I thought that was about salvation. But now I see it's about every room in my heart, every locked closet, every broken corner. He's always knocking, gently, patiently, persistently. And when we open even just a little, he steps in with light. The invitation wasn't to perform, it wasn't to prove, it was simply to be. To be with him. To be honest. To let him love me as I was. That kind of love changes you. I stopped trying to fix myself before coming to him. I stopped editing my prayers. I started talking to him like a friend, like a father who wasn't disappointed but delighted. And that's when healing began. Not because I tried harder, but because I trusted deeper. The mess didn't scare him. It drew him near. And in that nearness, I found peace. Not the kind that depends on circumstances, but the kind that anchors you when everything else is shaking. So if you're standing in your own silence, wondering if God wants anything to do with the broken version of you, hear this. He's not asking for the cleaned up you. He's asking for the real you. And when you say yes, even a small one, he meets you there. Not later. Not once you've fixed it all. Right now. That's the invitation in the middle of the mess. When grace begins to build again, grace doesn't always rebuild in the way we expect. Sometimes we think it'll be a grand return, a triumphant comeback where everything broken gets fixed overnight. But grace isn't a fixer, it's a healer. And healing is often slow, sacred, and strangely quiet. That was the season I entered after my first yes. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, but it was real. The first thing grace rebuilt in me was trust. Not trust in people, not even trust in myself, but trust in God's character. That He was good even when life wasn't. That He was near even when I couldn't feel Him. That His promises held true even when my heart still ached. I started to read scripture not for information, but for connection. The Bible stopped being a textbook and became a love letter. I'd sit with passages like Isaiah 43, where God says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." Not if, but when. And that one word undid me. I realized God never promised life without storms. He promised presence in the midst of them. Grace was showing me that safety isn't the absence of struggle, it's the presence of God in the middle of it. So I kept walking, still messy, still learning, still limping. But I was walking. There were days I wanted to quit, days I felt like healing was taking too long, days when the enemy whispered, "You haven't really changed." But in those moments, God would send reminders. A friend checking in, a song that played at just the right time. A journal entry I forgot I wrote that now read like prophecy. Grace was building again, not on the ruins of who I used to be, but on the identity God always saw. He wasn't interested in resurrecting my old self. He was creating something new. The ashes weren't a problem, they were the material. Beauty from ashes isn't a metaphor, it's a process, a holy one. I started serving again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I began sharing my story in pieces, first with close friends, then in small groups, and eventually with strangers. Every time I spoke, shame lost its grip. Every time I told the truth, the lie that I was unworthy got weaker. Grace builds with honesty, and honesty led me to community. Not just church attendance, but real, raw, soul-bearing community. People who didn't flinch at my past. People who didn't offer cliches but held space. People who reminded me that brokenness doesn't disqualify, it qualifies us for grace. That's when I understood the church for what it really is. Not a museum for saints, but a hospital for the hurting. And I was one of them. Still healing, still vulnerable, but also somehow stronger. Because grace doesn't just put you back together, it makes you whole in ways you didn't know you were lacking. I began to pray differently. Less about outcomes, more about presence. Less about getting answers, more about staying close. I stopped asking God to change everything around me and started asking Him to change me in the midst of it, and He did. Not by removing all my struggles, but by giving me strength within them. Not by giving me control, but by teaching me surrender. This part of the story, the rebuilding, wasn't as exciting to outsiders. There were no big moments, no sudden breakthroughs. But to me it was sacred. Because I was learning to live loved. Not just occasionally feel it, but actually live from it. I no longer saw grace as a rescue operation. I saw it as a relationship. ongoing, deepening, unfolding. And that's when I realized healing isn't the absence of scars. It's the presence of hope in spite of them. And hope had returned. Grace was building again. When redemption starts to show, you don't always notice redemption while it's happening. It's not loud. It doesn't burst through the door with trumpets. It creeps in softly, like light stretching across a dark room at dawn. That's how it began for me. Not with fireworks, but with small signs that something inside me was changing. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning, brushing my teeth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I didn't rush to move past the reflection staring back. I just looked, and I saw someone I didn't hate. I didn't fully love that person yet, but I saw value. That alone was a miracle. Redemption started to show in how I treated others too. I found myself listening more, interrupting less. I became slower to judge, quicker to forgive. I no longer needed to be the smartest or the strongest in the room. I just wanted to be present. That shift wasn't from willpower, it was from grace. The kind of grace that softens you from the inside out. I stopped striving so much. For perfection, for approval, for applause. My prayers changed from God use me to God be with me. Because I learned that sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't in what you do. It's in who you are becoming. People started to notice, not in big ways, but in subtle moments. A friend pulled me aside and said, "You're different, lighter somehow." And I realized it wasn't just a feeling. God's redemption was starting to reflect on the outside what he'd been rebuilding on the inside. I got a chance to apologize to someone I had hurt. And instead of excuses, I offered ownership. Instead of shame, I felt freedom. That's redemption. Not erasing the past, but owning it and watching God write new endings. Church felt different too. It wasn't a stage to perform on, it was a sanctuary to rest in. Worship became more than songs, it became breath. I didn't have to raise my hands to prove anything, but I wanted to. Not because I was worthy, but because he was. One day during worship, the tears came, not from pain this time, but from joy. A deep, overwhelming joy that came from knowing I was loved. Not the future version of me, not the cleaned up version, but me. Right there. That was the moment I realized. I was living inside redemption. It didn't mean life was perfect. I still had battles, still had days where the enemy whispered old lies, but I had new weapons now. Truth. Community. Scripture that wasn't just read but lived. I clung to verses like Joel 2:25 where God promises to restore what the locusts have eaten. That verse felt like it was written just for me. God wasn't just healing me, he was redeeming the years that pain had stolen. And the most surprising part, he started using my story to help others. What I once saw as shameful, God turned into a testimony. People who were still in their own mess heard mine and found hope. Not because I had it all together, but because I didn't. My scars became bridges. My vulnerability became ministry. That's redemption. God didn't just clean up my life, he made it count. Every broken piece found purpose. Every tear watered seeds I didn't know I was planting. And now, beauty was blooming. If you're in the thick of it, if you're wondering whether God can really redeem your mess, let me say this. He can. He is. Even now. Especially now. Redemption might not shout, but it always shows up. Sometimes it looks like breathing easier. Sometimes it's sleeping through the night for the first time in months. Sometimes it's smiling without forcing it. Sometimes it's finding your voice again. These aren't small things, they're sacred signs. You won't always notice redemption in real time, but when you look back, you'll see it was there, threaded through every ordinary day, woven into every conversation, whispered in every quiet moment where you chose to hope instead of quit. Redemption isn't a destination, it's a rhythm, a way of walking with God where you no longer run from your past, but let Him use it. And when that happens, when redemption starts to show, don't shrink back. Don't apologize for the light. Stand in it, shine, because your story isn't just being restored. It's being rewritten by the author of grace himself. The calling after the rescue. You don't survive grace. You don't walk away from it unchanged. When you've truly been rescued, when your life has been pulled from the ashes and placed in the gentle, scarred hands of Jesus, you don't go back to business as usual. You begin to live with a new kind of fire, not the frantic fire of striving, but the steady flame of purpose. This is where the story shifts, from being saved to being sent. It started with a whisper again. Just like the first one that said, "Let me in," now there was a new one. Tell them. At first I wasn't sure what it meant. Tell who? Tell what? But deep down I knew it was time to stop hiding the healing, time to stop protecting my pain like a secret. It was time to speak, but fear was still there. Fear of judgment, fear of looking weak, fear of being misunderstood. And yet the more I wrestled, the more I sensed the Spirit saying, "It's not about you. It never was." And so I began to tell the truth. First in safe spaces, with friends who had walked with me through the mess, then slowly, more openly. In blog posts, in Bible study groups, in testimonies shared at church, and with every word, freedom expanded. People didn't recoil from my mess, they leaned in. Because what they heard wasn't shame, it was hope. Not a sanitized version of faith, but a raw, redemptive one. A God who meets you in the middle kind of faith. And that's what people are starving for. This was my calling, to be a witness, not a performer, not a preacher, a witness. Someone who saw grace up close and could say with confidence, "Yes, He really is that good." The enemy tried to use my past to shame me. God used it to launch me. Every painful chapter now had a new assignment. To tell the world that nothing is wasted, that brokenness isn't the end, that God writes the best stories with the worst parts of our lives. And suddenly, everything became sacred. Conversations with baristas, Uber rides, Instagram captions. Every moment was a pulpit. Every breath, a chance to point to the one who rescued me. People started sharing their own stories, quietly at first, timidly, but there was something about going first that gave others permission to speak. And I learned this. Your story of rescue will always be someone else's survival guide. So I kept going, I kept telling, not because I had something to prove, but because I couldn't keep it in. Jeremiah said it best, "His word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in." That's what it felt like, the gospel on fire inside me. And then came the bigger asks, speaking engagements, ministry opportunities. Platforms I never chased started to open. And with every door I asked God for one thing, keep me small in my own eyes and big in yours. Because this wasn't about fame, it was about faithfulness. The calling didn't come with a spotlight, it came with surrender. I didn't feel qualified, but I felt chosen. And that was enough. Because when God rescues you, He doesn't just restore you to neutral. He launches you into purpose, into assignments that carry eternal weight, into divine appointments you could never manufacture on your own. Now I live with a sense of holy urgency, not anxious hustle, but a deep conviction that every day matters. Every person matters. Every story matters. And I know this. If he can use me, he can use anyone. If he can turn my rock bottom into a testimony of grace, he can do the same with your story. So don't wait to feel ready. Don't wait to feel perfect. If you've been rescued, you've already been commissioned. The calling is now. Tell your story, live your redemption, and walk boldly into the purpose God has for you. Because this isn't just about being saved, it's about being sent. This is your calling after the rescue. And if this story stirred something in you, if you found even a flicker of yourself in these words, I want to invite you to take the next step. Don't just let this be another video you watch and scroll past. Let it be the moment something shifts. Share this testimony with someone who needs to hear it. Someone still stuck in the mess, someone who thinks their past is too far gone. Leave a comment. Tell us what part resonated most. Let your voice add to the chorus of redemption that God is writing through all of us. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not to follow a channel, but to follow a journey of grace, healing, and purpose. You are not alone. Your story matters, and the best is still being written.